That's basically what Jaws is, and all of these films that these guys were making were consciously mythologically inspired. In the Renaissance, the analogy is that when the poets and artists and painters of the Renaissance discovered the writings of Plato and Plotinus, they brought them over, Greek refugee monks brought them over from Byzantium, which was under siege by the Muslims, and they brought this body of writings over that had been lost to Europe, Plato and Plotinus. They learned about Neoplatonism, they learned about the philosophical concepts, and then they set to work transforming Christianity into a new mythological system whereby the paintings are these sort of visual equivalents of Neoplatonism. So that to really understand the paintings, you need to know what the philosophical concepts they had in mind were. They're sort of these visual icons, and they're based on an equivalent of recognizing equivalences between the Christian mythos and the Greek and Roman myths. At that time, too, depth perspective was being discovered in painting, and there was a whole new awareness of space and spatial expansion. And the discovery of depth perspective was the technology there. The philosophical concepts of Neoplatonism was the mythology, and they just transformed this whole thing and created a whole new movement out of Western art. And I see our filmmakers doing something very much analogous to that in Hollywood since the late 60s, early 70s with these mythological films.
You write in your book that the novel has entered its twilight, and then on your website, which is cinemadiscourse.com, which I enjoyed very much, you have an essay entitled On the Rise of Dumbass Culture.
Yes.
So is something replacing, is literature dying, is film replacing it?
It really is. Literature is dying, and you know, I wrote that essay it's not in the book, actually. I had a difficult time finding a publisher for it, but it was based on the insight that I kept watching these remakes of old films in which all the literary references were gone, but yet in the original film, like a classic example is Born Yesterday, which was a film, black and white, I think it's a 1940s film about a woman who is taught how to read. And a man takes her and she learns how to read and think for herself and realizes that her boyfriend, who's a mobster, is basically, you know, a sociopath, and she learns to think for herself. And we see all these shots of her in the film, you know, with stacks of books behind her and learning all these things. Then in the remake in the 1980s with Melanie Griffith, all the books are gone, all the literary references are gone, but yet it's the same story. And you can find this in film after film after film, in remakes of old movies, so that the culture is getting dumber, it's getting stupider. And the thing about that is this is not the first time that it's happened. I've traced this in civilization after civilization. They slide down into a period of illiteracy, and it's a very gradual process. In ancient Egypt, this happened, for example, in the New Empire, 19th dynasty, 20th dynasty. What happened was the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which was based on a series of illustrations along with texts, slowly began to die out, and you began to lose the text. And finally, they were just left with these images, and they stopped putting in the text at all, and the culture was falling apart too. The arts were getting worse. The coffins were not being made very well. Most of the traditions were getting forgotten. Some of them were getting confused. And there was a general falling away of literacy there too. And it also happened in the Roman period. You know, in the Roman period after Marcus Antoninus in about the 2nd century AD, there aren't any Roman writers left. Nobody's doing anything with it.
But so literacy then recycles, it looks like.
It recycles, it dies down, and then there's a dark age. Usually the culture and every culture does this, enters into a dark age, goes to sleep for a while, and it may be centuries before it wakes up again, and then literacy reemerges. And I think we're entering the first stages of a dark age. We're entering it, and electronic technology, you could say that electronic technology is causing this to happen, but the fact that it's happened in these other cases leads me to suspect that it's a natural and organic process, and it's not something we can do anything about. It's the culture is just dying. The myths have been forgotten, and literacy now is something that is brought into question. It's something that is even sometimes seen as a bad thing, as something that can cause, you know, war and aggression and so forth. And so it's being, you know, it's not even thought of anymore by a lot of people, even in the intelligentsia, as a positive attribute. And that's a bad sign. So we really are sliding down into a new dark ages.
Well,
it's an image-based culture, and you know the Middle Ages were image-based too. And it was thought that Gregory the Great said that painting could do for the illiterate what books do for the literate person, and they can convey the Christian tradition strictly through images to the illiterate masses, and something similar is happening right now. We're conveying all this stuff through the media to the illiterate masses who spend more and more time on internet and watching television than they do sitting down reading books anymore.
Except shows like this.
Yeah, this is the exception.
Yeah,
right.
of course. Yeah. I mean, you even mentioned earlier that in the New York Times book review, they're starting to review graphic novels.
Yeah, I saw that recently. That's a big change. I don't. That's something fundamental has to be happening for the establishment at that level to begin taking that art form seriously. And it's a change from the word to the image, and sort of from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. And
But some would say that's a balancing, though.
I don't think it is a balancing. I think what's happening is that the technology is destroying the culture. And I mean, technology is it's not a neutral thing. Every time you bring about a new gadget, you don't just add that gadget to the sum total of gadgets.
Marshall McLuhan, sure.
Yeah, and Neil Postman was another man who talked about this. When you bring a new gadget in, the automobile is a classic example. It demolishes old ways of life. Like, for example, the automobile brought with it, particularly out in the Southwest, these vast freeways. And with urban sprawl, it got rid of this idea of community, of you could just walk outside your house and walk up the street and say hello to 10 people, and everybody knows everybody else roughly. And the automobile destroyed that, particularly out in places that I came from, like Phoenix, where the automobile has taken over the city entirely. And it creates this decentralizing urban sprawl that prevents a culture from effectively ever emerging, because people cannot culture comes out of communion. People have to be able to reach each other. And this society of isolated people, living in their automobiles is not a valid cultural process. It's a technological one, but the technology is disturbing the culture there. It's interfering with it. So I don't see it as a balance.
Supplanting it, basically.
Yeah, I don't see it as balancing at all. I just see it as a disintegration of literacy and a disintegration of the great Western tradition, and probably, as in the analogy with the older civilizations, probably it's a necessary process, something new. In order for something new to emerge out of this, the civilization has to fall apart. And it's a natural process. It's akin to any organism dying, reaching the end of its life cycle. And it has to do that. It has to go to sleep before something. And new myths will come out of all of this. They're working their way up through the surface right now.
Again, your latest book is about film. Can we return to the theme of film? Because you've mentioned some films that have like an iconic status in our culture. Can you mention some others that have a similar status?
Yeah, Close Encounters of the Third Kind is one of the big ones, and that's a film where the Book of Revelation is the primary mythological backdrop there. The mothership that comes down out of the heavens is the spiritual power coming down from heaven to earth as the New Jerusalem. That's exactly the image you find in the end of the Book of Revelation. It's the same image in Spielberg's film. That's an updating of that cosmology transformed into popcorn cinema, but it's basically dialoguing with that older tradition. Same thing in the films of James Cameron, for example, The Abyss, particularly in the director's cut of that, where you see that the aliens who live under the water plan to wipe civilization out with a gigantic flood. That's the old myth of the flood, the Near Eastern myth of the flood, and these beings who will wipe civilization out. That's a very, very old myth. And so there are quite a few films. Apocalypse Now is another film that recycles these ancient myths. In that case, the myth of the reign of the king, whose end must be is brought to an end by a predetermined cycle of time, and he has to be killed. And the killing of him is necessary for the land to be reborn, because he embodies the vessel of fertility. And if he's sick or weak, then the land will be corrupt and sick and weak. And in the case of Apocalypse Now, the metaphor is that he's insane, and his insanity is manifesting itself outwardly through the insanities that they encounter on all these little voyages. And it's also a kind of modernized retelling of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, where you get this idea of a solar ship that goes underneath the earth, and it sails through a river underneath the earth, where they encounter all these underworld inhabitants and monsters, and then finally they get to Osiris, and he's the Lord of the Dead, and the sun god Re is regenerated from contact with Osiris, and then he comes back up to the upper world. It's the same structure in Apocalypse Now, exactly, with the little boat going up the river and reaching Kurtz's compound, and then the rain comes at the end as a renewal. And so
now, you mentioned James Cameron earlier, and in your latest book, you have a list of your 16 all-time favorite films. Titanic ends that list.